Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Howard Heckman, one of the developers here at PTS. Today, we're going to be doing a Getting Started with TracerPlus Connect webinar. So thanks again for joining us. We'll be going through kind of all the setup of TracerPlus Connect, a little bit of touching on the handheld and how you trigger the syncs and get that up and running, and also deploy the project to a handheld. Before I jump into TracerPlus Connect, I'd just like to touch on the different pieces of the software that are required when using TracerPlus. So the main focus today will be TracerPlus Connect and setting up a synchronization, but really the TracerPlus Connect product is used to sync data with TracerPlus running on your mobile devices, so iOS, Android, or Windows devices, and you configure that handheld application, TracerPlus, by using TracerPlus Desktop. So you can see here on the screen the three components of TracerPlus Desktop. This is the design tool for creating the forms and configuring the handhelds that then get deployed to the handheld. Again, this could be iOS, Android, Windows. And you can build in a range of different data collection features. So TracerPlus supports barcode data collection, RFID, NFC, and even BLE for scanning for beacons. And that is running on the handheld itself. So again, that's designed and deployed from TracerPlus Desktop. The focus today, TracerPlus Connect, this is the syncing tool. So this is the tool that's used to basically marry up the forms that you create for the handheld to your backend database or backend system. So you can see there's a number of supported database types here that you can sync to and from the handheld. So again, it's the tool that you'll be using in order to get the data to and from your TracerPlus mobile forms that you've designed in TracerPlus Desktop. And I'd just like to mention all of this setup today, you can go ahead and configure. You can download from our website at TracerPlus.com. The software comes with a free trial, so you can go ahead and start setting everything up that you see here today and begin syncing your mobile devices to your backend databases. So again, that's TracerPlus.com. Just head over there if you'd like to download and install any of the applications. You should see like a try it free button up at the top of the website. You just click that, fill out a form, and you get all of the software on your PC. So with that, let's talk about the first kind of setup that I'd like to show you in TracerPlus. And these are really TracerPlus Connect the basics. TracerPlus Connect is, again, the syncing tool that's allowing you to move the data from a source to a destination. And the source can be your backend database, your text file, Excel spreadsheet, any number of places. And the destination could be another database, Excel spreadsheet, text file, or a TracerPlus session or form that you've pushed out to the handheld. So I'm going to go through just setting up a quick sync process using TracerPlus Connect. We'll review the sources and data destinations, so where you can grab the data from and where you can push that data to when you sync this data, and we'll perform a sync on the handheld just so you can see that in real time. So I'm going to hop out of the PowerPoint here just so I can head over to TracerPlus Connect. Now, I have an empty project here, and I do have a project that's been deployed to my Android device. So on the right-hand side here, you can see I have a project called Data Collection. I just quickly created a product scan form and an inventory form that I pushed out to the handheld using TracerPlus Desktop. And if I were to jump into here, you can see the form that I've created. It's just a very simple form for collecting a barcode, a location, a description, quantity, scan date, and a username. And I actually already went ahead and used that form to collect some data. So you can see I scanned a barcode, I used the drop-down to select the location, entered a description, and keyed in a quantity there. And I've collected these three records on the handheld. So this is typically how you use TracerPlus. You'd fill out the form that you've created using TracerPlus Desktop. You'd save that data, and now we have those rows of data on the Android device or iOS device or whatever it might be, saved on this handheld. So the first sync that I thought I'd set up for you guys today is to actually show you how to get the data off of TracerPlus and put it into a database or other format by triggering a sync. So if I jump over to TracerPlus Connect, you'll see that I have basically a non-configured setup here, but I'll kind of talk to you and show you how this is configured. So TracerPlus Connect has what's called sync processes. And a sync process is made up of just two kind of simple things, a source of data and then a destination of data. Like I mentioned before, the source can be some type of database, SQL Server. It could be a TracerPlus session, Excel spreadsheet, a text file, or Salesforce. And you can grab the data from these systems and move them over to move that data over to the destination every time this sync process is triggered. So I want to get the data off of a TracerPlus handheld. So what I'm going to do is set the source to be TracerPlus. So now I have the TracerPlus as the source. Since I've linked my project that I created in TracerPlus Desktop, you can see I have my two forms that I've created, a product scan and an inventory form. If I go back over to the handheld, you'll see that I can go to the home screen. You'll see the product scan and inventory form. Now I had the 3 records in product scan. So I want to set that as my source of data on the left-hand side here. On the destination, I can pick where I'd like to send that data when this sync is triggered. So you have another large selection of options here. You can send it to an ODBC database. So this can be something like Microsoft Access, MySQL, could be SQL Server, Oracle, anything like that. There's a SQL Server native client here, so you can just enter your IP, username, and password to a SQL Server database. You can send data to another TracerPlus session, so you could send it to maybe the inventory, which I'm going to show you in a minute, but you could send it to the inventory session. You can go to an Excel workbook and sheet. You can go to text file, Salesforce, and then the last option here is a template, which I'll get into in a little bit later as a more advanced option, but this allows you to go to web services and things like that. For the demo just now, because I want to set up a basic sync, I'm going to go to ODBC, and I'm going to select a database that actually comes with TracerPlus Connect when you install the application. And it's a Microsoft Access database, and you can see here, this database, which will be installed with TracerPlus Connect, has a number of different sample tables in here. I actually want to populate this product list. So you guys may already have a database that you want to sync with your handhelds. It could be Microsoft Access, it could be something else, and the setup is very much the same. But let's just say I want to get those 3 records that I just created on the handheld into this database. So what I'll go ahead and do here is from my ODBC setup, I'm going to go ahead and select from the data source dropdown the TracerPlus Connect sample. Now, if you had some other database here, you could go ahead and select it, like MySQL or SQL Server. But for the demo today, I'm going to go ahead and select TracerPlus Connect sample. In the case of some of the database types, you might have to enter a username and password, but for Microsoft Access, we don't. We then will see that the table dropdown here is populated with all of the tables, views, and the stored procedures that are inside of that database. And you can see if I open up this list here, it matches what you see in the tables list in Microsoft Access. So I wanted to populate that product list table, so I'm going to go ahead and select product list here. And then I'm going to reset the mappings down below. So the mappings are really just marrying up the fields that you have on the handheld, like you can see in our product list form here, barcode, location, description, so on. These are the fields that are on the handheld, and we want to marry them up to the appropriate fields in our product list. So I'm going to go ahead and just move some of these around. So for instance, the part number, I want to marry up to the barcode field, so I'm going to move that one up. Location, I'm going to match to location. Description to description. The quantity on hand, I'll marry up to the quantity field on the handheld. The scan date, I will go ahead and open this dropdown and do date scanned. And now I think I have one-to-one here. So I have barcode to part number, location to location, and so on, and then the username that I collect on the handheld to the scanned by field in our database. So that's all we need to really do to set up a very basic sync. And this one will basically take all of the data that's been collected in TracerPlus in our product scan session, and when the sync is triggered, it will send all of that data over to this product list database table based on these field mappings. Just one thing to note, you can change how the data is sent to the destination. So you can append new records, you can overwrite the records in that destination, you can update records and so on. So you can change how as those rows come and as they're being inserted into the destination, you can change what happens to them when they do that. I'll leave this as an append for now, and it should just take our 3 records and move them over to the destination side. So that's a simple sync process. And again, let's go ahead and name this one because you can add a number of different, call it download product. And now we know that when we trigger this sync process, it's downloading the product that we've created on the handheld, our Android device, and sends them over to the product list and appends that as new data. So really, you're giving somebody out in the field the ability to use this form for maybe keying in new product or something like that as you're building out your inventory using the barcode scanner on the device. So that's all I'm going to configure for this one. I'm actually going to go ahead and save my project. I'll jump over to the Synchronize tab here, and this is where you'll actually see activity from devices out in the field. So I've already configured this form here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this configuration in a minute, but I added a simple sync data button to my form, which the user can go ahead and click here, which will then actually communicate with TracerPlus Connect, send that data to TracerPlus Connect, and Connect, based on your configuration there, will push it over to the destination. So if I were to go here and hit refresh, you can now see those 3 records that I created on the handheld are now been inserted into this access database. So it's very simple setup. I just had it take this product that was created on the handheld, and now it's dumping it into this Microsoft Access database and allows you to move that data from the source to the destination. So quick, simple setup and easy to configure, even in the trial mode of TracerPlus running on the handheld, as well as TracerPlus Connect in a trial mode if you'd like to do that. So I'm going to jump back over to the PowerPoint because I wanted to jump into the next point of configuring TracerPlus Connect. And really this one has to do with just a network overview of how TracerPlus Connect needs to be configured for a synchronization to a mobile device out in the field. So there's a lot of common problems here that people will make when they're setting up their synchronization from the handheld that will give them different error messages on the handheld, which I'd like to kind of cover now, that you may know you'll easily be able to take a mobile device running Android, iOS, or Windows, configure that to sync to TracerPlus Connect. So we'll just review how the handheld communicates, discuss the server network settings, and an overview of some of the common problems. Okay, so with that, let me jump back over to TracerPlus Connect and talk about some of the configuration for communication with the handheld. So in TracerPlus Connect, it's a server-based application. So you're installing it on a Windows machine, a Windows server, a Windows PC, and it's running. It has to be running on that PC. And then you have devices out in the field that need to be able to sync to this server. So the most common setup here is that you would need to make sure that your TracerPlus Connect install is on the same network as your Android or iOS devices out in the field. So that could be the same Wi-Fi network. It could be like a VPN type connection back to this server. And if it's not on the same network, you would have to set up what's called port forwarding on the outside portion of your network so that the handhelds can sync to a PC or server running TracerPlus Connect internally. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the ports that TracerPlus Connect uses and needs to be open for this to work. So if I go to the Tools Preferences dialog here, this is where you configure the TracerPlus Connect communication settings, so like the port that it's listening on. I mentioned TracerPlus Connect is listening on a port on your PC or your server, and they're defined here. So I have port 4403 and port 4404 configured for TracerPlus Connect, and those are the 2 ports that it's listening on. So any device out in the field on your, say, Wi-Fi network or a WAN network would need to be set up to sync to one of these 2 ports here, either 4403 or 4404. And if it's pointed to that, it would be able to open up the connection to the server and perform the sync just as I did here. So a couple things to note on that. These ports need to be open on your PC or server. So make sure that no firewalls block these ports. They need to be open so that this server can receive that communication from TracerPlus from your Android or iOS devices so that it can perform the sync. The other thing you want to make note of when you're setting this up is the IP address that this server is currently running on. And a quick and easy way to determine what that IP address is, and also the port, because it is displayed here, is to open up the event log in TracerPlus Connect, and then go over your Tools menu and hit Stop Server and then Start Server. And this will show you right here that the server is currently listening on 192.168.4.137, so that's my IP address on this PC, on port 4403. So I know that I need to tell the handheld, this is the IP address that you need to sync to when you hit the sync button, or in my case, that download product button. When I hit that, it needs to open up a connection to this right here. So you can come here and get this information, 4.137 and port 4403, and then use that in your TracerPlus desktop settings. So if I jump over to TracerPlus desktop, for my data collection project, if I go to the Connect settings here, I want to enter that information that I just saw from the tool, from the event viewer in TracerPlus Connect. I add my host, I enter that IP address, 4.137, port 4403. So again, when you're configuring TracerPlus desktop, so this is the configuration that's deployed to the handheld, you want to make sure that this setup here matches what you just saw from event log. If you, again, stop and then start the server, you'll see that information there. So again, 4.137 is my IP address, port 4403. I simply take that same value, jump over to TracerPlus desktop, put that in here, hit the plus button for my hosts in the Connect settings, and set that up as my host. It's 4.137 on port 4403. So a couple issues that people typically run into here. They'll use a different port. So if you're deploying from TracerPlus Desktop actually uses port 4409 as the deployment port for your projects. A lot of people will typically, or will put 4409 in here, and then it will attempt to sync to TracerPlus Desktop, which is the design tool for the handheld, which is what you're dragging and dropping and creating those forms for. So don't put 4409 in there. You would want to put in this setup here one of the two ports that you have configured in TracerPlus Connect. Most commonly 4403, but if you're using TracerPlus Connect on the Windows service, it could be 4404 as well, and you would want to go ahead and enter that here. The IP address also, this IP address is not the IP address, say, where you're running TracerPlus Desktop, but it's the IP address where you have TracerPlus Connect installed. So again, this application here, TracerPlus Connect, you would want to double check that IP address and port and put that in here as the IP address and then port that you're syncing to from TracerPlus Desktop. Okay, so that's a common problem there, is you just put the wrong port in, and then when you go ahead and try to sync, it'll say either login failed because it couldn't establish a connection to the server, or it'll actually try to sync to TracerPlus Desktop, which that'll just fail as well because it's meant for deploying your projects. So the common setup, common problem with configuring your synchronizations from the handheld. Also, one of the more common things, like I mentioned here on the Tools Preferences dialog, these ports do need to be open and not blocked from TracerPlus, from like a firewall or some type of antivirus software that might be blocking these ports on you. You'll again get login failed when you go ahead and try to sync from the handheld, because that communication will be blocked by that firewall. Finally, like I mentioned as well, the easiest way to get this up and running is to make sure that your Android device that you have is connected on the same network as your TracerPlus Connect software is running. So typically your PC would be just wired into your router. Maybe it's a Wi-Fi router. That the mobile device then needs to be connected to that Wi-Fi router on that network. If you're connected to like a WAN, like a cell phone data plan, you won't have communication back to TracerPlus Connect since this is inside of your network. So common things to kind of look out for as you're setting this up, that ports are open and that you've matched the ports you have configured here to what you've configured in your TracerPlus Desktop project. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over to the PowerPoint. Just to jump into next, I wanted to actually show you more of the settings within TracerPlus Desktop. So TracerPlus Desktop is what is used to configure your mobile forms to trigger the sync. So when you've configured TracerPlus Connect to do a sync from a source to a destination, the handheld is really in charge of what actually triggers that sync to go when a user clicks a sync button. So like you saw in my sample project here on the handheld, which I can bring up, I have this sync data button. That's actually what's triggering that sync process to run. I'm pressing that button out in the field on my Android device, and it's going to go ahead and trigger that sync on the TracerPlus Connect server to move the data from the source to the destination. So when we're in TracerPlus Desktop, we need to configure the project to sync. We have to add the hosts, like I actually already mentioned, to our TracerPlus Connect settings. We'll take a look at the sync button and how you can configure that sync button to go ahead and trigger the sync itself. So if I jump now over to TracerPlus Desktop, in my project here, my data collection project, I already talked about this previously, but in the project settings, you would go to the Connect settings on this tab, and that's where you add your host. So you're going to go ahead and add that IP address and port, and this is the host that the handheld communicates to when it goes to do the sync. So you just add it to this list here. And one thing you want to note is this ID, which typically in most cases is one. Some people will actually have multiple hosts that they want to sync to. So maybe they want to sync to not only 4.137 to send the product scan data, but maybe they have a different application that they've deployed for TracerPlus where they want to sync to a completely different server, a different set of data. So you can actually add additional hosts here. The most installs only have the one host where they're syncing to a single TracerPlus Connect. So in almost all cases, this host ID you see here will be listed as one. If you added additional ones, it would be 2, 3, and so on. But you can just remember this host ID here because we will be checking that in the button that we click when we go ahead and perform the sync. So on my form, you can see I have a sync data button that I added to that. So if I jump over to that form, my product scan, and go to the form designer, you'll see here's my form that I deployed to the handheld. Again, I just have some settings here like barcode, location dropdown, and so on. But I do have this sync button. So if I didn't have this, I would be just saving data to the handheld, and I would have no way of getting it off. So I want to be able to offer the user the ability to collect their barcode data, click the sync, give them the option to click the sync data button that would then push all of the records that they've just created on the handheld over to that TracerPlus Connect server, which then posts it to the database. So to do that, you simply add a button to your form using the button toolbar here. You then, on the right-hand side, when you select it, change the button action to be do sync, like I have selected for my sync data button. So to do sync, when you do that, you'll be presented with a couple different properties here for that sync button. Now you can see the first one is the sync host ID. Now that goes back to the host that we have configured in TracerPlus Connect. It's this ID here. So all it's telling the handheld what to do is that when the user presses this sync button, I want you to communicate with host 1, which is 4.137. So that's going to be the TracerPlus Connect server that we want to sync with. The next property that's the most important here is the profile ID that we want to sync when the user presses this button. Now, if you go back to TracerPlus Connect, you'll notice you can have multiple profiles in your TracerPlus desktop project. I just have one, which is labeled as Sync Profile ID 1. So this tells TracerPlus that when the user clicks our Sync Data button, it's going to sync with host 1, and it's going to tell TracerPlus Connect to sync Profile 1. So it's going to go ahead and sync this. So it would go ahead and move all of the source data to the destination for any number of sync processes that we have in our TracerPlus Connect install here. So essentially, when the user clicks this, it's just syncing one profile, one process, and moving the data that was just collected from this form over to the Microsoft Access database here and inserting those records. So if I were to go ahead and do something like key in another record on the handheld, select a location, this one's in storage, a description, product 4. The user's again just using this form to fill this data out and maybe keying in a quantity of 50, hitting enter, saving that record. Now I have 4 records on the handheld. This will actually sync and append those records to that destination. So I'm going to go ahead and let me bring up Connect. On here, I'm going to go ahead and select that Sync Data button again. It's going to go ahead and sync with TracerPlus Connect, push that data over to the destination, and now we'll have 7 records in here with the first 3 followed by the 4 records that I again submitted and appended to this database. But you can see that new product 4 that I just entered is now inside of Microsoft Access. So just to recap there, we added a sync button to TracerPlus Desktop, which we deployed to the handheld, called Sync Data. It syncs with host ID 1 and profile ID 1. Host ID 1 is, again, this 4.137 Windows PC running TracerPlus Connect. Profile ID 1 is the first profile that we configured inside of TracerPlus Connect. So now, just to illustrate that a little bit more, I did want to send or set up a sync that'll send data to the handheld rather than send data from the handheld to this Access database. So what I'll do in this case is I'm going to add an additional profile to my project. I want to link it up with my data collection project here. So I've got a new profile. This one will be sync to handheld. I'm going to add a process to this, and you'll notice actually when I did that, you'll see this profile is profile ID 2. So I'm going to set up another button that actually syncs with profile 2 rather than the first one. So for this one, I'll call it upload product. And in this case, I'm going to select ODBC. I'll select that same database table for this sync, just so you can see those records getting pushed back over to the handheld. So I'll select TracerPlus Connect sample, product list table. On the destination side, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select TracerPlus, and I'll go to a different session, in this case, inventory. And now I'll go ahead and set up my mappings here, which will be, in this case, I just have the 2 fields on my handheld side, but part number to the barcode and location to location. Okay, so I just have those 2 fields that I need to marry up. There's only 2 fields in that second inventory session. And you can see that over here. If I were to jump to my inventory form, I just have barcode and location as my 2 fields. So when I sync this profile, it's going to take the data in this database table here and push it over to the destination, which in this case is the inventory session on the handheld, which is the other form that I have available here, this inventory form. So if I click on view data for inventory, you can see it's currently empty on the handheld. So inventory has no data, but I want to populate it with the data from this table. So I'm going to need a way for the user to get that, or to trigger that sync. And actually, I do want to do one other thing in this sync. I want to overwrite the data on the handheld. So every time you sync this, it doesn't duplicate the data on the destination. So I have my product list now overwriting the data in my inventory with any data that is coming from this source. So now I need a way of triggering this sync. So I'm going to save this. I'll jump back over to synchronize. I'll go to my inventory form. So now I have a new form on my handheld called inventory, and I want to give the user an option to download the current inventory with the download inventory button. So I added a button to my form called download inventory. I changed the button action to be do sync from my properties over here on the right-hand side. And now I'm configuring the sync settings for this sync button. Again, I'm going to sync with the same host. It's the same TracerPlus Connect install. So I'll go ahead and set the host ID to 1. But in this case, I want to sync the other profile. So I'm going to sync profile ID 2, which is that second profile, which is sending data to the handheld. So sync profile ID 2 is selected for this button. So that's all I need to configure. Just as a note, to deploy any of these settings, you would hit build deploy here. Hit deploy. And then on the handheld, you go ahead and go to the menu option up here on the top left, hit download project, and then you just hit download project there from this form, and it'll download that project and make those changes on the handheld so that you can see this inventory button on the handheld, which I had already deployed. But if I go to this form here, and let me open up TracerPlus Connect in the background, if I were to jump into my inventory form on the handheld, you can see I have download inventory as my button, which I'm going to go ahead and click here. That's going to connect with TracerPlus Connect. You can see that sync happened really quickly, and it pushed 7 records over. when the sync completes on the handheld side, if I go ahead to the home screen for inventory and click View Data here for this inventory, you'll see I have those records that I had in the Microsoft Access database now available on the handheld, and then I can use these for lookups or something like that, where I'm displaying data to the user from your Access database or whatever backend system you're using. Just to try that one more time, and you can see the change in behavior here. Let's just say I wanted to go ahead and say delete these duplicate data from this, and then maybe I'll add a new record here on the Access side, so you can see this getting pushed over to the handheld. I'll do product 5 with a quantity of 80. So now I have location is actually going to just push these two values over. But I entered a new record in Access, and if I go over to the handheld, let me bring up Connect in the background, and go to, again, back to this inventory form. I'm going to click Download Inventory again. Now it synced 5 records because I deleted a couple of them. Pushed those over to the handheld, and it should have included then that new record that I entered on the Access side, which is this Warehouse 3 record here. So you can see it also overwrote this data because I said to overwrite, and so every time I sync it, it's not going to create or not going to append to this database on the handheld, but it will basically make a copy of the Microsoft Access table over in TracerPlus running on the handheld, and so you can use that for maybe scanning product and displaying the location to a user, or scanning product and seeing the description, things like that, based on the settings that you have configured in TracerPlus Desktop. Okay, so that's how you configure a sync button so that the TracerPlus mobile application can sync with TracerPlus Connect and move your data back and forth between your backend system and the handhelds out in the field. So I'll jump back over to the PowerPoint here. And just briefly talk a little bit about the extra syncing types that are available in TracerPlus Connect. So what I showed you today, the first thing is the sync modes that are available. So I showed you the batch syncing, which again is moving data from a source to a destination based on pressing a sync button. That is the most common type of setup with TracerPlus Connect. You're getting your data from some other system, putting it into TracerPlus, maybe doing something with it on the handheld, and then moving it back to one of those other systems by then downloading that data back to Oracle or wherever it's going. But you can also run TracerPlus Connect in a real-time mode, where you're actually, through a very similar configuration, you're marrying up your forms on the handheld to one of those database tables or backend systems directly. So it's not a source to a destination, but it's really just marrying that form up to the database table, say, that you want to save and retrieve data. And when you run it in real-time mode, the handheld, when you actually fill out that form, saves the data immediately to that database table that you've selected. So it's not a sync process where it moves data from one side to the other, but you fill out your TracerPlus forms and it saves it to the handheld. There's also a ton of different data providers available to sync with in TracerPlus Connect. ODBC really gives you flexibility on across a lot of database types. So it could be MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, Access like you saw here today, PostgreSQL, things like that. There's a lot of different options. It could go to a Amazon EC2 database server where you're running like Aurora or MySQL. You'd point an ODBC driver to that database, and then you can sync with that data to and from like a cloud database in AWS. There's SQL Server, and then as well as syncing with Salesforce, Microsoft Excel text files. A lot of people will use text files where they sync the data they've collected on the handheld to a text file, and then they have some maybe legacy system that'll just import that text file into that system to process the data that way. And there's also the template endpoint, which I did want to actually jump out of this PowerPoint here and just kind of mention again in the TracerPlus Connect side. So here you can see, like I mentioned, you have ODBC, SQL Server, Excel, text files, and things like that. On the destination side, you can also select something. I'll add a new sync process here. Let's call this one sync to web service. This is becoming a much more common way of syncing data in TracerPlus. They're downloading data into a web service. So you would go ahead and maybe select TracerPlus as your source of data. Maybe it's your product scan session, and you want to send this to a web service. So what you can do is actually select the template endpoint or the template destination. The first thing you do is select a report file that is basically a file that defines what that data looks like that's getting sent to the web service. Most commonly, this is a file that generates JSON data so that you hit a web service with JSON data that can then be processed on that web service and inserted into whatever system it might be. But it could also just be straight text data. It could be XML data, but that file will generate that output that gets sent to an endpoint here in the the sender dropdown. There's a couple samples that come with TracerPlus Connect. If you click this folder button here, you'll see a samples folder. There's an email sample because you can send to an email, an SMTP server, as well as a JSON sample here for formatting JSON data. And it'll actually create a JSON array that gets pushed over to the endpoint that you select. So once you have the file that defines what that looks like, you can add an endpoint. The two endpoints we currently have available are SMTP servers or URLs. An SMTP server allows you to send an email. So this is commonly used if you wanted to fill out this form with data and then maybe send all of that, maybe send exceptions that have been created on the handheld to an email address. And that could be an exception report that gets sent to somebody in case something happens on the handheld. You can send it as an email of your data. But you can also set it as a URL. So the URL allows you to put in something like a web service here, because it'd be just an HTTP endpoint. So something like tracerplus.com/API, this doesn't actually exist, /v1. But you put your URL here, the method that you're posting to that URL, the content type here, probably something like application/JSON, any headers that you want, a username and password. And basically what this does is the data that's sent from this source gets packaged up into an output. And in this case, it would be JSON, and then posted to this URL that you have selected here. So it's sending that data to a web service, which is then consuming that data on the web service side and doing whatever it needs to on that. This is another newer option in TracerPlus Connect. So something you could take a look at if you have a web service that you need to get data into from your mobile handhelds running TracerPlus. But just to recap again, you have ODBC, SQL Server, TracerPlus, Microsoft Excel workbooks. That's actually another common one. If you go ahead and select Excel, you can navigate to the workbook that you'd like to use and select the sheet that you'd like to sync with. And just like you saw with going to Microsoft Access, you're marrying up the fields of data that are collected by the handheld to the columns in that worksheet, A, B, C, and so on. You just marry that up and sync it. And the last option is text in Salesforce to send data to those to Salesforce or to text files, which are generally then imported someplace else. So again, thanks for joining us today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.